Welcome. I'm Eric Miscoll, and welcome to this episode of the Eric Miscoll Show. Appreciate you taking time to join us today. Our topic today is the manufacturing of EVs, and been looking forward to this show for a while, but let me do a couple of housekeeping points before we get into it. All of the guests on the show will be muted. If you have any questions that you wish to pose based on the conversation, please use the question tab at the bottom of the screen. And this is being recorded and will be rebroadcast on EMS Now next week as in video format, and then ultimately as a podcast as well. Manufacturing of EVs. I really believe that EVs are the next growth wave for the EMS industry. If I think back over the last 20 some years and how the EMS industry has grown in size and capabilities, I think of these product waves that have hit the market and propelled it. And I think it's starting with computers and then with the communications equipment, both networking and the cell phones, had dramatic impacts on the industry. And I think EVs are certainly that for the next many years ahead of us. So to discuss this, we've invited two guests today. Joining us is Michael Kolmer. He's the director of the Automotive Business Division within Zollner Electronic. And Zollner, of course, is one of the large global EMS companies. And Brian O'Leary, who's the global head of e-mobility and infrastructure with Indium Corporation. And not to give him short shrift, but joining us again, Phil Stoten finally broke out from his exile in Australia to get over to Europe, and we're glad to see him out and about in the industry again. So welcome, Phil.
Thank you. Live from Cornwall.
Yes, live from Cornwall. Gentlemen, before we get into the discussion, let me just allow each of you to introduce yourselves and your companies briefly for the benefit of our audience. And Brian, why don't I begin with you?
Sure. So my name is Brian O'Leary, and as you stated, I'm the global head of e-mobility and infrastructure at Indium Corporation. Indium has been supplying for about 10 years soldering related materials, thermal interface materials to the EV market. So it's not entirely new to us. And we've been a supplier to electronics in general from the very beginning. And we just marked our 88th year this year.
Wow. Excellent. And Michael, introduce yourself, please.
Yes, thanks. So my name is Kolmer. I'm here in Zollner as a director responsible in the Automotive division. Yes, we work here as a EMS supplier for individual solutions. So all over the products in medical, in aerospace, in railway technology, and of course also in the automotive sector. And in the automotive sector, we are running now on EV business, let's say more than 10 years already. Yeah, I'm glad also to be here and to be part of the show.
Excellent. Hey, quick question from the introductions. Brian, you talk about e-mobility rather than EVs. When you look at e-mobility, what do you cover beyond electric vehicles?
So I think the term is a good one because EV or e-mobility is really an ecosystem. It's not just the vehicles that we drive or fly or trains. I mean, there's a lot of different modes of transportation, but it's also the supportive infrastructure. And when you think of infrastructure, it's not just the charging stations, but it can also be the battery storage systems that are pairing with charging. So it's the bigger world of electrification.
Yeah, I think that's an important point because clearly this whole market is a lot more than the vehicle itself. So thank you.
Excellent. EV is certainly the future, right? I mean, that's the trend moving forward, but it's certainly not going to be without some challenges, especially from a manufacturing perspective. So, and I appreciate the question Phil just posed, because I think as far as sizing it, it is both the vehicle categories and also the charging and the infrastructure that goes with it. Let's start maybe big and talk about the adoption of EVs and how that's growing and how this is varying, because we have traditional markets, right? We have traditional And Brian, I saw you refer to it as ICE, the internal combustion engine kind of type of vehicles versus the EV is kind of a distinction that's being drawn. And I think of a country like the United States that has God knows how many hundreds of millions of cars on the road, right, that are mostly internal combustion engine. And you contrast that with some countries in Europe where it's primarily EVs now, right? So, so I guess I'm just trying to get a sense of how you see that, how you see this adoption differing around the countries around the world, and the impact that's going to have on the market. Brian, why don't I start with you, and then we'll go to Michael.
So the question is the market differences or
no, more specific,
Yeah,
how that's differing. The adoption of EVs globally differs in regions.
So if you look at, I think a good way of looking at it is China certainly is a powerhouse in EV. A lot of the development work, a lot of the new technologies. I mean, they're not the followers of yesteryears. They really are the innovators, especially on the battery side, which is the most costly and perhaps the most important part of the supply chain for EVs. China is driving all of it in terms of technology, in terms of the inputs from mining to processing of the materials. But China's adoption rate right now is about 19%, which is significant considering the size of the market. And if you compare, a country like Germany, I'll let the other guests address Germany, but it's right up there as well. And the United States really does lag. It's less than 4% of the entire market. But as we're all aware, there's been some pretty significant legislation in the United States to try to move that forward a little bit quicker, move the dial. $7.5 billion are being allocated to just charging infrastructure for EVs in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's a cultural thing, Brian, that the adoption is slower? Do you think it's more that, I mean, China's a different thing, but I think in Europe, some of the countries, particularly Scandinavia, which has very high adoption, the sustainability side is significant, but also the government incentives to get people into EVs seems to be quite substantial as well.
I think it's a combination of all of the above, but keeping in mind that climate change has been very much top topic for a lot of governments who are driving policy, and the policy trickles down to adoption. So you take a country like Norway that has very aggressive government incentives, and I think it's now 7 out of 10 vehicles bought in Norway today are EVs. It's astounding. I think they have somewhere upwards of 80-85% adoption, but of course it's a very small market, a few million people. But at least here in the United States, you could make an argument that Tesla wouldn't exist today if it wasn't for government incentives. A lot of the money that they made selling EVs was not from bottom line factory, cost and sell, but rather the incentives that were coming in from the government to get those products out on the road. So yeah, plays a big role. But I also think, I think we can't underestimate the consumer and what is going to happen in the next few years when the F-150 Lightning starts hitting the streets. It's just a better truck. I mean, you line up an F-150 Lightning to its internal combustion engine counterpart, and think of yourself as a contractor. This thing has this massive frunk, so it's just this empty front trunk. They call it a frunk. Yeah. It's got 11 power outlets. It's got a massive bidirectional battery. And if you go to their website, it's kind of funny, actually. They advertise it as, well, you can frame a house, or you can build a deck, or you can have the ultimate tailgate party with a hot tub, a 42-inch TV, and a blender. And it's all being charged by your truck. But, think about it. If you're a contractor and you got all your tools, and maybe you're out on a job site that doesn't have power, what do you do? What do you do today? You bring in diesel generators. You can't be able to do away with all of that. And then you got to get a cab for the back of the truck to lock up all your tools. This truck, you don't have to. You just throw it in the front where it's already plugged in.
In the front.
And the other amazing thing, wrap your brain around this. this truck, it sounds like I'm doing a Ford commercial. I think I'm
It
doing
does.
a pretty good job. But it's a $39,000 truck, the base.
Wow.
And then you
Wow.
add government incentives on top of that. Here in Colorado, it will cost somewhere around $25,000 to $28,000. That's half the average cost of a truck in the United States. I mean, this
And
is
I-
a truck
Yeah.
economy.
And am I right in thinking that the F-150 is the US's largest selling vehicle anyway? You know,
40
you
years.
are-
Yeah.
yeah, you are.
I
a
have
truck
one in
economy,
the, I
and-
have one in the driveway, right?
And next time you pick me up at Dallas Airport, I expect it to be silent.
We will see. So let's bring you in. What is your view about the adoption and how that is in the different countries and maybe in Germany as well specifically?
So I would agree what Brian said to the topic from China or from Asia. So for sure, Asia is here a really big market, and I think also the adoption here is very big. You also mentioned Norway, for example, or Sweden also. I think the market is here smaller, but the point here is why the e-mobility or EVs have so big chances for me. The opportunity of a small market means I can also have easier infrastructure behind. And this is a topic when I look on the US or even in big Europe countries, you have a problem to get the infrastructure. And this has to be planned. When I look to China, even the newcomers of electric vehicle suppliers, they are thinking how they can give a support to the owner of a car, not only to have a charging system there, also to have trucks, as you mentioned, where I can support and charge the car, or changing batteries and so on. And this has to be fixed, and we have to find solutions in the right markets. So for me, both is growing, and the topic also in Europe, why it is growing. And I see at least in the next 5 years, a huge growing of EVs. Also because when we look on the crisis we have, when we look on the prices of increasing what we have, and for sure also the political requirements we get, for example, in Germany here. I see here big advantage to have here EV cars.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And, you know, it's interesting too. I think that when I think of EVs, you know, I don't immediately think of, you know, the big automakers, right? I think of the Teslas become the poster. Mm-hmm. And you see these other ones, you know, coming up too, right? And so it's really kind of this exciting time of the growth of an industry. And I think kind of the traditional automotive sector is reacting to that and is also being impacted in a dramatic way. So I guess what challenges do you think this poses for manufacturing of EVs within that infrastructure and within who the players are? Because surely there'll be upstarts who are going to fail, right? And just like there were with the original automotive industry. Brian, do you have thoughts on that?
So I think just from getting a product out the door, yeah, I mean, a lot of these automotive makers have announced new vehicles. They've got the prototypes out on the streets and they've taken reservations. And you look at the backlog for some of them, it's going to take years, not months, years to clear out the backlog. And this is all happening in the context of where a lot of the batteries, you know, going back to the batteries and talking about China, how they really lead the world right now. This hasn't really been figured out yet. For the demand that's coming, there isn't enough supply to fully build out all the vehicles that we're talking about. Could it be online by then? I'm sure. You just look at the massive investments that are being made in the billions to build all these battery plants. But still, even if you build the battery plants, a lot of the raw materials that go into the batteries need to be processed. And there's only one place in the world that can do that right now, and that is China, because they made the investments 10 years ago. So this is going to be a real challenge looking, you know, 5-8 years from now, when they say that, you know, somewhere between 25 and 30% of all vehicles, at least here in the United States, are going to be EVs.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, Brian? We're at a juncture at the moment in general supply chains where there is supply chain security issues, which are leading people to move certain pieces of their business out of China, or looking at a China plus one strategy, or reducing dependence on China. And as you say, this contrasts with it hugely, because as we push towards this more EV enabled and battery enabled supply chain, they've got a pretty tight hold on many key parts of it. So it's going to be an interesting challenge going forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Hey, Michael, from an EMS perspective, I think there's also a shakeup, I think, that's happening, right? Traditional OEMs, I think EMS, there's an opportunity as there's more electric there and less, I guess, mechanical parts within an EV compared to traditional things. And that you know, the way the automotive used to be, you had the OEM, the brand at the top, and then these various supplier tiers, right, underneath that. It seems like that's getting shaken up a bit, right? So what's the role of the EMSs playing, and how are they growing and expanding in this market now?
Question to me.
Yeah,
for sure. So I think when we look on the information before, I also agree that the OEMs also have to go deeper in the supply chain. So we saw it from Tesla, or for example, he also got into discussion with supplier for chips and so on. And now when we see on the market the supply chain getting worse and worse, or got worse and worse, now let's see what happened in the next half year or in the next year. We do not have to forget that not only the EV quantity is growing. You mentioned already the infrastructure, but also all the other electrical parts due to Corona and home office and so on. Industrial electronic also growed a lot. So we see it also in our other areas we supply. And so the market getting really, we do not get so many parts. So the role from the OEM is now changing, because he has to go deeper in the supply chain and secure capacities, because automotive has to get also attractive for car manufacturing, because we have laptops, we have telephone chips, and they are also need a lot of electronical parts. And so next, he has to get the technology in-house, he has to get also the supply chain, and this is also a big challenge for newcomers. The big OEMs, maybe they have the capacity and also the manpower and also the money, but the newcomers also has to plan and to fight with these challenges a lot.
Yeah, Michael, just on the topic of supply chain, I've been talking to people recently, and they've been telling me that the chip shortages has eased a little bit in the automotive sector. TSMC have switched production a little bit more to automotive. Obviously, that has a negative impact on other sectors. But is that right? Are you seeing an easing a little bit in the supply chain for your segment?
Yes, so you mentioned already TSMC, for example. So this, I think everybody knows about the situation. What I see now is this big backlog we had. It's went now more and more to the front and back end production from the suppliers. So let's say the capacities are not here. They are not planned for this huge increasing we had now. And now the increase is going on, but the supply chain is empty. So we really, the supply chain has to fill up, and then we go into a normal way for production. But now it is really a fight, right? And now it is really a fight every day to get parts in-house in the right time, in the right quantity.
Yeah, it's not a lot of fun being a supply chain manager right now.
For sure.
And if I could add to that, speaking about the, how the market is changing, it really has been turned up on its head. Automotive, I'm speaking of, and if you think about it, 20 years ago or so, when the automotive industry, at least here in the United States, was struggling with bankruptcies and government bailouts, there was a real move to move some of that in-house production, maybe short runs for beta testing and so forth of printed circuit boards and farming it out. So a lot of it moved to the tier ones. Guys our age who had the experience on lines probably haven't touched a production line in 15, 20 years. And now they're in a position where for many years, they've relied very heavily on tier ones. I would say they've been a bit coddled in that, you know, it was kind of the whole module was built, the mechanical as well as the electronics. And often the electronics would come from a tier two and they would integrate and then sell to the OEM. So the OEM was only dealing with a tier one manufacturer. What's changed, to your point, is that these vehicles are mainly electronics now. I heard a number somewhere between only 2 to 3% mechanical versus an ICE vehicle versus an EV. That's astounding if you think about it. So you've now got the OEMs working directly with the traditional tier twos, which are in essence kind of like a tier one because they're buying directly from them. And what's happened, and you know, when I talk to the OEMs behind closed doors, they're saying to us, please help. We've lost sort of, and especially COVID just made it worse. We don't have the hands-on anymore. We're not in the factories like, let's say a US manufacturer has the factories down in Mexico. You know, we're having issues. We need to know what questions to even ask. And I haven't even gotten into the topic of how electronics have changed. I mean, they've changed dramatically with the longer mission profiles that you see with EVs. So it's a real struggle. And to Michael's point, so you add on top of all of this, a scarcity, not only of parts, but a scarcity of who can make the product. Yeah. So within the CMs or the EMSs, there's kind of the big houses are not really interested in doing prototype builds, you know, 100 boards here. No, it goes to a small mom and pops and they're just scrambling. And the crazy bit is when, you know, from my perspective, it's often kind of a hands-on conversation. You see how things are built. Wow. Yeah. You know, a lot of the concerns or processes you would have seen like with a tier one is just out the window because you're dealing with maybe a contractor that's building boards for washing machines, and now they're building something for an electric vehicle. So it's a really challenging time. I would call it the Wild West right now.
Yeah. Well, it's shaking up the whole industry, isn't it? And you know, I think it's really interesting when you see what is developing in the industry. You're seeing the big EMS companies, companies like Zollner, particularly around that kind of 1 to 5 billion in size, really building really great relationships with car makers and really building out the expertise internally and having that automotive team where they can support the car maker throughout. You're seeing large ODMs in China like BYD that are just, you know, huge experts in EVs that could almost, you know, if you wanted to build the Brian O'Leary EV, then you could probably buy that from one of those ODM companies. So it's kind of, you know, it's what we've seen before in the industry in terms of industry evolution, but happening at breakneck speed and happening with all these disruptions in the background, which, as you say, Brian, creates this kind of Wild West environment. Michael, when you look at it from Zollner's point of view, what do you have to put in terms of your infrastructure, in terms of your support to be that ideal EMS partner for an automotive company?
Yeah, I think Brian said already, some of the EMS make boards for washing machines and so on. The difference between a washing machine and electric vehicle is, I think, with the washing machine you do not drive 100 km/h or more on the highway. So there are a lot of new requirements we have, and there is our knowledge of what we have here since more than 50 years, and let's say it's a totally different business if I build up a car or if I make a electronic board assembly. I have technical cleanliness requirements. I also have the soldering restrictions, specifications, and so on. So the point is, as an EMS supplier, I think we have also more knowledge in terms of industrialization. So how we can build up a product or how we can develop a product. It's not that we can develop the product or an inverter or a DC-DC or whatever, but we know as an expert how a board or electronic part has to look like, that we build it up with the right quality and with the best price in serial products, because there is a lot of quantities. And Brian, you mentioned already about the sample production. Here I can go to everywhere to make it quick and dirty, and to have something in hand to try something. But in the end of the day, we're producing millions of cars. And when we look on us or our family, we want to have a safe car, and the electronic is the biggest part in the end of the day now, what we have in the car. Before it was pure mechanical, and now let's have a look what we have.
Yeah, and it's mission critical, as you say, and it has, for me, having the smaller volumes or the prototypes manufactured at different facilities at completely different companies kind of means you got to go through that whole learning curve twice.
Yeah, let me go ahead, Mike.
Sorry, what I want to mention, but nevertheless, the sample building up is very, very important also for the EMS, because as earlier as you are involved in the design, and this is the chance of the EMS also, the more we can change with the development together and to get the best product for serial.
Yeah, and so it's always been with every product, and it's a constant lesson that OEM should learn.
Yeah, but you know, you're making excellent points, and I guess it brings to mind the risk inherent in this too. I can see where traditional company, but we also have some upstarts that are going to be coming, right? Who say, "Oh, EV, you know, you can make a fortune here. It's the new Wild West, right? Whatever," and some will fail, but within there may be. I mean, these are life-dependent. People's bodies are going in it. You're making the point. It's not your washing machine. So what are the risks inherent in that? What about you're mentioning quality, and EMS, of course, will talk to quality, but will the rush to get product to market overshadow quality sometimes? Are there the same standards that are being applied within SMT and within EMS companies now, the same ones that will apply within the EV? Are there new ones developing? Brian, what's your sense of this?
The answer is yes. So what we're finding in a practical, from a practical perspective, you know, I'm a soldering guy. So when I look within the world of just soldering with the longer mission profiles, and what I mean by that is, think of it as duty cycles of EVs. They're running longer, they're running hotter, they're running at higher voltage. They're asked to do a lot more than a traditional ICE vehicle. You know, when you charge your vehicle at night, it's on. When it's plugged in, it's on. So it's going through a lot more. And on top of that, with autonomy and a lot of the functionality, I mean, these vehicles are, I like making the analogy with iPhones. You know, before the iPhone, it was just a device to make a phone call and maybe limited texting. Now you look at the iPhone, and the phone part is probably the least important. It does everything else. And I'm not saying that EVs are the iPhone yet, but they are becoming something very different from just a mode of transportation. It's going to be a battery storage device, a communication device. I mean, and when you add all that functionality, well, you've got a lot of electronics and you're putting a lot of duty on it. And my point is, we're also finding that the electronics are becoming denser, more populated, more powerful chips. And a lot of that has been being driven from just the standpoint of the functionality that I mentioned, but also to try to make them lighter, because the lighter the vehicle, the longer the range. And what that all means is these boards are not the simple automotive boards you might have saw maybe 10, 15 years ago. These are boards like you'd find in a Cisco router. I mean, they're complex. And because of that, the standards that are on the books today, a lot of them are not keeping pace. You know, back to solder paste, we look at SIR as a way to test for quality. And if you look at the current IPC SIR specs, they're way out of whack with what an EV actually needs to do. For example, it's like you test for 168 hours. Well, longer mission profiles, a lot of the automotive guys are now testing to 1,000 hours, but that's not the spec. That's just tribal wisdom that's developing. Another example is the pitch between components. The old or current spec, I should say, is like 0.5 mm, but most boards are 0.2. So to your question, there's a lot of catch up, and it is an industry that's moving very, very quickly. Everybody recognizes that. There are bodies like DKE, IEC, they're trying to get out ahead of this. Germans, by the way, are playing a very proactive role in trying to get the specs to really reflect reality. But in the meantime, the issue I see is, in the absence of direction from the OEM, the EMS or the CM is just going to go to the spec. And if the spec isn't meeting reality, then you got a problem. So it comes with experience, and this is kind of the conversation we all need to be having. And I was real excited about being on this show because there is a disconnect right now. Yeah. I feel between the OEMs and contractors and suppliers, because it's just a different animals what we're talking about.
Yeah. So does there need to be more partnership between companies like yourself, companies like Zollner, the car makers, maybe some of the OEMs that are involved in that supply chain, to kind of rewrite those standards, or just to create working groups that can get the spec right for the product?
I would say yes. Matter of fact, there is an effort right now within IPC that I happen to be part of to try to kickstart that conversation between the different suppliers, not necessarily suppliers in the manufacturers. It's not necessarily to say, hey, we need a new spec, but we're even being more pragmatic, and that is, we just need to have a conversation. Just recognize some of the challenges, because I mean, I'll be very blunt. I've talked to some OEMs that have taken an approach of just buying things off the shelf and putting it together, and voila, you have a vehicle. And I start talking about printed circuit boards, and it's almost like a blank stare. Like, well, that's a commodity. We just get that off the shelf. I'm like, okay. There's not a whole lot of thought that's put into it for someone. Yeah.
So Michael, from your point of view, do you have like a ecosystem of suppliers and partners that will share some of that load with you, that will help you develop best practices for the automotive business you're in, and specifically for EVs?
For sure. So I think partnerships, as you mentioned, is one of the most important things. So we cannot speak only from suppliers and also from customers. I think the whole supply chain needs to be in a partnership, to be very open also about problems and also possibilities we have to get this new market really done. And we have suppliers, partners where we work 10, 20 years together, and we need these partners. On the other hand, you need to get also the technology know-how in-house to read specifications and so on. And when we go into deeper discussion, to do it with the partners.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to add something, and I wonder if, Michael, if you would agree with us. I find when talking to people within this space, and I'm talking about a pretty vast bandwidth or spectrum of people that are involved, from infrastructure to design to printed circuit boards to the technology, 5G, all of it. I find that people are pretty open and sharing information. Unless you're like a Tesla, because you've got everything to lose, you're the market leader, everybody else is trying to catch up. And I find that there's a very high level of openness and collaboration. And you only have to look at the news to see some of these crazy partnerships that developed, like Ford and VW working on the autopilot or AI together. Some, buying different parts of a vehicle for their vehicles. VW and Ford, another example. VW is going to be making the MEB platform, which is kind of the base platform, first rev of EVs, and they're selling it to Ford. And I believe that's going to go into their European cars. So these are just examples of partnerships. But what I find, maybe 10, 20 years ago, when you talk to Automotive, it was a pretty hush-hush. People were not open. And I'm finding now there's a high degree of openness. So that's encouraging in having this type of dialogue.
And Brian, what you mentioned now is partnerships which you read in the news or on a paper. The other thing is where is really partnership, where the people are open and communicate together to find solutions. This is the point.
Yes.
Yeah. Is that just what the automotive industry needed? Bit of a shake-up to blow the cobwebs away and open them up for communication and new ideas?
So in my point of view, they recognized already years ago, and now they are going more and more in this direction to have partnerships and to be open. On the other hand, also the EMS or the suppliers has to be open. Yeah. And also the suppliers, again, from the EMS.
Yeah, yeah, and it's all the way through. And it's not just car makers with car makers. You know, you see partnerships between Nissan and NVIDIA, or you know, tech companies and car makers kind of pushing new frontiers. And
and you have Foxconn announcing their three that they're going into the automotive production business, right? The EV. So we'll see
to make EVs on their own. Yes.
Yeah, we'll see. So should we expect recalls, Syria? I mean, with
are they going to be more reliable or less reliable than a nice vehicle?
Wild West. I go back to that point. We've entered the Wild West, and I think the only reason we don't see more of them now is because there's really not that many vehicles on the road from the new upstarts. I mean, they're still scaling up. I hope not, but just from a practical standpoint of what I see being built today, I can't imagine it not being an issue. Just because some of the builds are just to the point I was making earlier about specs. It's going to be interesting. You know, we've already had a massive recall, and for the audience, if you maybe you've never even heard of it, but GM's Bolt was catching on fire, and General Motors was telling their customers that, hey, don't put it in the garage. This is all last year. Don't park it in the garage. And then they changed their tune and said, don't park it within 50 feet of another vehicle. And I think they also said you couldn't charge it over 80% and you couldn't let it go below 10. So it basically made the car inoperable for a lot of people that needed to go a certain miles. Point is, it finally worked out the issue, and it had to do with LG, the supplier of the battery, having, I think, two different manufacturing defects that if it both happened to happen in the same cells, you had a problem. They paid $1.9 billion to GM for this. I don't think most people even realize. And, you know, $1.9 billion would put a lot of people out of business. So it's going to be an interesting time.
Michael, I see you holding back there. What are your thoughts on it?
I do not want to say in general that we have to think about more recalls or something like this, because there are differences, I think, between the OEMs. There are already OEMs which are long in the business. There are also newcomers, but the experience I have and with the OEMs where we work together, I see that they are very careful when they bring something in the market. So they do really a lot of tests. So and to see also if the life cycle, everything goes well. And so in my point of view, I do not expect more recalls than like in the normal automotive sector. Okay. For sure, it will increase, Brian. Sorry, but it will increase because the quantity will increase of EVs for sure
on the street. Yeah,
but in percentage, I do not see. And again, everybody is very careful and do not want to have a bad news that his car, because all of them want to sell cars. Yeah, and so
well, I think there is another dimension to this. you think of, and I'm going to use Germany as an example because Michael is sitting in Germany. Germany is a good case of do it right the first time and then get it out the door. Now, contrast to the old kind of the joke of Tesla when they started out, and they've gotten way better. But Tesla's whole philosophy was ship it now, fix it later. And Tesla came from a technology company learning to build vehicles, and it took time to learn how to build vehicles, and they've gotten very good at it. But in the beginning, the fit and finish was kind of dicey there, but it's gotten certainly a lot better. But what's really interesting is Dice, who's the CEO of Volkswagen, invited Elon Musk to come talk to Volkswagen. And he's pounding on his people that, look, you got to get product out the door a lot quicker. I mean, I forget the numbers of how many months it takes Tesla to turn something around, but it was like night and day between the two manufacturers. And I think it's that, there are right and wrong ways of doing things, but sometimes two ways can be right.
Yeah. You're absolutely right.
And it's kind of a convergence between these models that I think is going to be part of the struggle, or like I said, the Wild West. You say recalls, because some people are going to do it right, but maybe they never get to market.
Yeah,
because
that's the trouble, isn't it? That's absolutely the problem, and it's the collision of two industries. You look at the consumer electronics industry, and you mentioned the iPhone that has, maybe a 12 to 24 month update cycle in terms of new models, and the car industry that maybe has a 7-year cycle, and neither of them are necessarily going to be right for the EV market. So the EV market has got to figure out where it exists in terms of all of those market and industry dynamics. And as you say, the idea of, can we just get a product to market, a proof of concept, and then can we, evolve and improve on the fly?
Of course, there's going to be issues, but I can't help but think that the EMS industry can be a great enabler for the industry here, for the growth of it here, right? I think that with being really arguably the holders of most manufacturing knowledge for electronics these days on the planet, right? More so than with the OEMs, and also having facilities around, depending on where, so if we're talking about trends like onshoring, if you need to do prototyping, if you need to develop these, managing supply chains, being resilient, being flexible. It seems to me there's a great opportunity for EMS companies in here, which is good, but that also means a lot of EMS are probably going to try to jump into this and develop an automotive side to the business now to try to ride this growth wave. So I think there's pros and cons in there. Michael, as an EMS company, how do you view those opportunities for yourself and for the industry?
Can you repeat, please, Eric?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Point.
Yeah. What do you see as the kind of the opportunities and risks for EMS companies in serving this industry? EVs specifically.
Yeah, so as I mentioned already before, to bring in the know-how of industrialization to get a serial good product, and also to support in the development already, this is the big point that we can bring us into this market. And next to the EVs, for sure, Brian mentioned before, the infrastructure. I just looking on inductive charging systems, that maybe in a few years there will be also a market to implement this, because everybody want to have a comfort charging or something like this. So we have to bring these ideas, and we have to organize the supply chain, and also to bring in our know-how for plannings, because next to all these points, for production and technology, we do not have to forget the supply chain and the planning behind, because we need to have a long-term planning to get components and to plan the components at our suppliers, because otherwise we have not the possibility to bring cars into the market. And so here we need to have a really close communication to the OEMs and to support here. And and what I mentioned with the technology, we have to think what are the right production technologies, because it's not our product. We do not deliver any products for EVs. We have to supply the right production technology for serial electronics.
Yeah. Brian, how do you see it as an EMS opportunity here?
I think it's going to be a boom for our industry, without a question, for EMSs. And I'll make a couple points. If we think about EVs today that are on the road, take a Tesla or Audi or, many of these kind of, call them luxury vehicles. It's not the mom and dad with kids that are buying these vehicles typically. General Motors, I was sitting in a conference, actually put out some statistics, and I chuckle at it. It was a white male, average age 52 years, $172,000 income, and lives in a separate single home dwelling. So they actually have a place to charge. That is your average buyer of an EV today. What's coming is, someone who's commuting to work, maybe 20 miles, it's got the kids in the back seat, is going to go grocery shopping. That's a very different vehicle than some of these high-end, like look at the Lucid Air, marvel of technology, but it's a $160,000, $170,000 vehicle. The EV of the future is going to be that $25,000, $30,000, maybe $35,000 vehicle. What's interesting is China, I don't know how many years this number, if it was the last decade or last 5 years, but an EV in China today is about half the price it was, and I forget the range. I think it's like 3 or 4 years ago, half. Meanwhile, in the United States and Europe, it continues to increase. I think it's a matter of time before the Chinese in force are in the European and US markets. And that is going to really change how people do business. If you look at the tier ones, I don't know, what are they, 15, 17% margin? Mm-hmm. And EMSs are typically somewhere in that 2 to 4. Michael, you could tell me, but it's an order of magnitude difference is my point. In order to compete, a lot of them are going to have to work through a more lean, more efficient supply chain. And that's coupled also with the fact that if you're not buying anything mechanical, it makes the barriers of entry for a lot of these EMS houses pretty low to be able to participate. So I think it's going to be a boom. And the last point I want to make is talk about onshoring. We've all learned a hard lesson through COVID, and that is having all your eggs in one basket over in China or some other market because you're chasing labor, the lowest cost, just doesn't work in this world anymore. If anything, you need to diversify. And if you look at the manufacturers right now that are getting into this space, not just US, European, Asia, I mean, all over the world, they're all coming to the US. They're all setting up plants, as well as US manufacturers in China. And so it's kind of an equal opportunity, I think, for everybody. It's not like old, when the first iPhones came out, it starts in one market and then it flees to a low cost market. I think with EVs, it really is an equal opportunity for manufacturers.
Yeah. And I think you are going to see some more of that regionalization, and, maybe the manufacturing ecosystem needs to reflect that. I hope it does, because I think it's a much more sustainable and much more practical solution.
Yeah,
I think what will be also interesting is what's going on with the energy costs, because the one thing is really what costs a fuel. On the other hand, on the other hand, what is about the energy for electric vehicles?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a whole nother equation, isn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting. I saw the quote this morning. I think it was Jim Rohn, the new CEO of Volvo Cars, calling EVs smartphones on wheels, right? So I think that kind of that captures it pretty well, I think, right? That these are true electronic products, more so, just like the smartphones of today don't resemble the old desktops phones that we all used to have. So, and Anyway, gentlemen, I want to respect our time here. I want to bring this to a close by thanking you both for your time today, for your sharing your insights and your thoughts on this. I think it's an exciting wave. I really do. I think this will be talking about EVs in the EMS industry for the next decade. We'll see how that plays out. There'll be some stuff going on there. So thank you both for your time. Maybe we can get a catch up in the future on some of these related topics. For the audience, I would say thank you. And we're going to do this again in 2 weeks. Phil and I are. Next episode, we're going to do a catch up on material supply chain. And we're going to have Don Akery with TTI and Dale Ford with the ECIA, giving us some updates on the current status.
Explaining where all those devices are.
Yeah, where everything is, right? And
but please let me know.
It's funny. I was talking to somebody the other day just about this. Remember when the Suez Canal got clogged up? Yeah. I mean, we all seem to forget that these things are coming so fast and furious, right?
Oh, yeah. It's just one disruption after another.
Yeah, that happened too, right?
Yeah.
So it's
and by the time we do that show, something else will have happened.
Something else will be happening. It's the new normal, I think. So, Brian, Michael, thank you very much for your time today. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to speak to you.
Take care.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.